Day one of the World Economic Summit 2018. I have the pleasure to be here with Guy Standing, professor at the University of London SOAS, co-founder of the Basic Income Earth Network, and leading expert in labor economics. Welcome, Professor, and thank you for being here and for your great speech. Actually, I would like to start from your speech, which centered around the growing security of the precariat, the crisis of frontier capitalism, and the need for a new comprehensive system of income redistribution based on universal basic income. At the core of your argument, Professor, lies the existential crisis of the precariat, who lack an old-style occupational identity. What's the origin of this condition of uncertainty, and how do you think universal basic income could help recreate a sense of stable identity in the precariat?
Well, of course, you're compounding a lot of issues in this question, and it's a very good question. I think the growth of the precariat has been one of the most dramatic outcomes of a period of what we call neoliberal economics, which began in the 1980s with the triumph of the Mont Pelerin Society and people like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, which was put into effect by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. But that period of neoliberal economics gave way in the 90s to a period of what I call rentier capitalism. And the rentier capitalism means that the inequalities around the world became dramatically worse. The share of income going to capital rose, the share going to labor declined, and more importantly for my narrative, the share of the rising share of capital going to rents, different forms of returns to properties, went up even more. And within the declining share going to labor, the share going in forms of rent to the upper income groups went up. And what happened was that a new class structure, a global class structure, has taken shape, with a plutocracy, not the 1%, it's less than that, of billionaires and so on, and an elite, and below them a salariat, people who have long-term employment security but are getting increasing parts of their income from forms of rent, from forms of return to property, financial, physical, intellectual. And the precariat has grown below that. And the precariat are facing insecurities of many types. The first is that they're being habituated to accept and internalize a life of unstable labor. Not like the old proletariat that was expected to be in full-time stable jobs for 30 years or whatever. They're being told you've got to accept a life of moving in bits and pieces without an occupational narrative. And very importantly for economists in the new phase of global capitalism, they have to do a hell of a lot of work that is not labor, that doesn't get recognized, remunerated, and so on. And the second thing is that the precariat has to rely almost entirely on money wages. Doesn't get non-wage benefits or rights-based state benefits or any forms of rent, and their wages have been declining in Britain, in the United States, in all industrialized countries for the last 30 years in real terms. And not only have the wages been declining, they become more volatile, more uncertain. And this uncertainty feeds into the fact that if you're in a precariat, you are living almost entirely, constantly on the edge of unsustainable debt. Debt has been a mechanism for rentier capitalism. And it's that combination that creates this existential insecurity, multiple forms of insecurity. And finally, even worse than these other aspects, is the people in the precariat have been losing rights. They've been losing the rights of citizenship. And it's not just migrants, it's all groups. So you've got a crisis where I summarize this crisis as the breakdown of the income distribution system of the 20th century.
Okay, thank you. This answer leads us to the second question. A recent report by the UK GMB Union states that in the UK there are nearly 10 million workers in condition of precarious employment, an extremely high figure if compared to other European countries. What's the origin of this poor performance of the UK as compared to other countries?
Well, since I wrote the books on the precariat, they've been translated into 20 languages and I get invited all over the world. It's a strange experience. I've given over 400 talks in 40 countries. And any British person listening to this should be informed that in numerous countries they're claiming that they have the biggest precariat. We've just done a PhD dissertation, I examined it recently, about the growth of the Chinese precariat. The Chinese precariat, many, many millions of people are part of the Chinese precariat. Japanese economist friends say that they think the largest proportion of the population who's in the precariat is in Japan. Then I get a story of Korea. So I think it's a global thing. It's particularly bad in OECD countries, but it's also taking shape elsewhere.
You also repeatedly claim that one of the factors worsening the wage situation in Europe is that effectively the precariat is in competition with labor force from the developing world. In this view, what is the impact of migration on European society? Does it create a downward pressure on European wages?
Well, we know the impact of migration is a very sensitive subject now in economics and in politics. I think you have to rethink what's happening. When globalization took off, and you have a liberalization, and you have a globalization of labor markets, where capital can move wherever it wishes, the new technologies and capital mobility means that any change in costs, relative costs in Britain or China or the United States, a firm can easily relocate. So I don't think it's the existence of the number of migrants. It's the fact is that if labor costs are lower in China, as they are, and productivity is rising faster in China as it has been, then obviously you're going to see a relocation of employment and a redivision of labor. And I think too much attention has been given to actual migrants rather than the fact that we have a globalizing system. And there's one statistic which every labor economist should bear in mind. In the last 25 years or thereabouts, the world's labor supply, the supply of labor to the global economy, has quadrupled. Quadrupled. And all of those extra several billion people are coming from economies where the average living standards are a fraction of what they are in Britain, so they put downward pressure on wages everywhere.
I would like to mention a comment by Bernie Sanders, who recently argued that the United States is not ready to discuss universal basic income, although he agrees that it could be a solution. He prefers to focus on raising the minimum wage, which he sees as a first step to promote a new cultural discourse in the United States. Do you think that it could be a good strategy, an effective strategy?
I think Bernie Sanders should make up his mind where he stands. Last year in the presidential campaign, he came out and said he was in favor of basic income. I'm worried that he's drifted backwards into an industrial strategy. We don't have an industrial manufacturing economy these days. We have a service-oriented tertiary economy. A minimum wage was a very appropriate instrument when you had a male-dominated full-time labor situation, where people were mainly working on fixed workplaces from 8:30 in the morning till 5:30 in the evening, or whatever it might be, where you could measure labor time in blocks. Then a minimum wage is, yes, I can establish a minimum wage and so on. If you adjust the minimum wage, it will be inducing an appearance of having an effect, as it has in this country. But what actually happens is that it encourages certain range of firms to outsource, to increase the number of part-time workers. So you become a part-time worker, you're paid part-time with a good minimum wage, but you're actually expected to work full-time. And that, many people in the precariat know exactly what I'm talking about, and they've written to me, and I've documented it in the book, that that has been a big factor. So you've had a huge increase in this country and other countries of so-called self-employment, which is actually outsourcing and getting people into insecure, where they're not covered effectively by a minimum wage.
Remaining on the political side, in many articles you argue that the precariat and in general the weak in our societies are sources of votes for populist candidates. Why do you think the political demands of the precariat have been so far intercepted by populists rather than by the left?
In the book, The Precariat, the New Dangerous Class, on page 1, I said, unless the insecurities of the precariat are addressed as a matter of urgency, we will see the emergence of a political monster. And you will not be surprised that since November 2016, many people have written to me and said, your monster has arrived. And I think one really has to look at the precariat as a huge number of people that are internally divided. This is something I developed in the second book on the precariat. The first group I call atavists. These are the people who feel they've lost a past. Their parents or themselves had full-time jobs in manufacturing, they were unionized, and they had the benefits of being in the proletariat. They don't get that themselves. They feel insecure, and they would look backwards because they don't have a lot of education. That's the group that has supported Trump, Brexit, Marine Le Pen, Orban in Hungary, many of the other unsavory neo-fascist populists, let's be blunt. The second group in the precariat, you alluded to this earlier, consists of what I call nostalgics, made up mainly of migrants, ethnic minorities, disabled, people who feel they have no sense of home. The first group feel they've lost a past. The second group feel they've lost a present. They don't have a home anywhere. Now this group will not be supporting neo-fascist populists, but they tend to be detached, right? But they're looking for the possibility of re-engaging. It's the third group. Maybe you will be joining that group, right? And others in the room, exactly. It's the third group, and you've got to empathize, if not join it. The third group I call progressives. These are people who was going to university, going to college, and they were promised a future, a career, occupational trajectory, security. And they come out of university, millions now, with debt, with the prospect of moving in and out of jobs and not knowing which way they're going, and facing insecurity, not able to form secure relationships because they can't have the security. And this group, of course, is not going to support the Trumps or the Marine Le Pens. They're looking for a new politics of paradise. And it's that group, I hope they're represented here and many places, many other places, which are not only looking for a new politics of paradise, but are beginning to join new movements. And I say to them, and including you if you might be joining them, we have no excuse for detachment politically. And I'm delighted about this summit because many young economists are coming to this sort of event. And my only message really is don't get cynical, don't feel we can't do anything about it, and don't get sucked into the money-making business orientation. We can do better than that. And I think the previous generation of economists failed that test.
It's on our shoulder. One last question, Professor. Regarding your recent experience at Davos, you have been there twice in the last few years. It is a summit of great leaders who could bring about the change you're urging. What was the reaction to your ideas there?
Well, I'm delighted, in a strange sort of way, that across the spectrum, including billionaires, trade union leaders, social activists, people on the left and right, are becoming more open to the idea of a basic income. I think it should be something that will be a part of the mainstream debate. I think we can afford it. I think it's the necessary step to building a new income distribution system. It's not a panacea. It's not something that is going to be easily introduced, but without a doubt, in my mind, and I hope the book shows that, the new book, the basic income is becoming a political imperative. It's becoming an imperative as we face automation and the robots and everything, which is going to make inequalities much greater. And it's an imperative to address the insecurities of the precariat. No other instrument on the table today can do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. And yeah, it's an honor to have you here.